The Vietnam War was the defining experience of the second half of the 20th century for the United States. It's also been the principal subject of research for me ever since I became a historian. So for the last 2+ decades, I have been engaged in deep research on fundamental questions pertaining to the war. How and why did it happen? Why did it last as long as it lasted? How did it end, and why did it end? I submit to you this evening that these are questions of profound historical importance. I want to reflect on them a little bit with you tonight, and I also want to leave you with one principal takeaway, a main lesson, as I see it, of this war that lasted so long, that was so bloody, a lesson that I think has great resonance for our world today. It started in a meaningful sense for the United States, or in earnest for the United States, 50 years ago. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson made two fateful decisions. First, he started a regular, sustained air war against targets in North Vietnam and against enemy-held areas in South Vietnam. And there was also bombing against Cambodia and Laos. Ultimately, 7 million tons of bombs would be used by the United States in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and in Laos. Also in '65, Johnson sent the first ground troops. The first combat troops arrived in South Vietnam on March 8th, and that figure would ultimately reach more than 500,000. The peak was actually early in the Nixon administration. So it became in 1965, because the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong matched this American escalation, it became a large-scale war in '65, 50 years ago. 40 years ago, 1975, also an anniversary year for us, the war ended in spectacular fashion. The so-called fall of Saigon, when communist forces swept in, took control of the South Vietnamese capital, raised the flag of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the war ended. And 40 years is a pretty long time, really. And it's longer than certainly many of you in this room have been alive. I can't say that for myself. But even so, even though it's now 40 years since the war ended, I submit to you this evening that Vietnam and what it means retains a powerful resonance in American political culture. It's part of our consciousness still, I think, to an extraordinary degree. And I sometimes reflect on why this is so. Why is it that apart from the Civil War, no event in American history, no event, has generated more self-reflection, more soul-searching, more debate about its legacy than the Vietnam War? Part of it, I think, part of the answer to that question is the colossal failure of the United States to achieve its objective. Its core objective in Vietnam was to sustain a non-communist Vietnam for the indefinite future. It failed. Second reason, I think, for this continuing resonance of the war in our culture is the false pretexts that U.S. decision makers used, first to intervene, then to expand U.S. involvement, and then to perpetuate the war year after bloody year. And I'll come back to that issue in a minute. And then, of course, the third reason for this power of the war still in 2015 is the brutality of the warfare. And I should say, the brutality on both sides. I'm focusing this evening mostly on the American experience. But both sides in this war fought with ferocity. And that brutality led to, of course, immense destruction and mass bloodshed. 58,220 Americans died in Vietnam. They came from large cities, they came from small towns all across the country. They answered the call when their leaders beckoned them to service. And they died. Their names etched in that dark granite wall that is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Up to 3 million Vietnamese died in the struggle. 2 million of them civilians. That is a death rate about 50 times the American rate. These dots each dot represents 1,000 deaths. This is the American figure. Lots of dots. This is the American figure plus an approximation, and that's all we can do, because the figures are obviously impossible to pin down when they're that large, the Vietnamese figure. These numbers, ladies and gentlemen, matter. They matter. And I want to say to you this evening that this war was unnecessary. It was unnecessary in hindsight, from the perspective of our time, but it was unnecessary in the context of its own time. That is a conclusion that I've reached on the basis of my research. And it connects to this lesson that I want to leave you with at the conclusion of my remarks. So why did the war happen? This is something I think we have to grapple with if we're going to then understand its meaning for us today. There are long-term reasons for the war having to do with the French colonial period, which began really in the latter part of the 19th century. It has to do with the Japanese occupation in World War II, the subsequent war between France as it attempted to recolonize Indochina, and Viet Minh revolutionaries led by Ho Chi Minh. Very important to everything that'll happen. But I want to focus here on the proximate reasons for the war and the proximate reasons for the US decision to make this a large-scale war. It's often suggested that it was hubris. It was a lethal combination of hubris and ignorance that brought the United States into the war. So a kind of exaggerated self-confidence. These pajama-clad guerrillas can't possibly stand up to the military might of the United States. They won't know what hit them. There is no way that we can lose this war. We are Americans. We've never lost a war. So that's the assertion with respect to hubris. And then accompanying that, an idea that American leaders had no idea what they were getting into. They didn't understand the enemy. They didn't understand the problems that would occur if they should intervene militarily. But I want to say to you that this is not correct. This is a mistaken view on both counts. I'm not going to say to you this evening that American leaders were experts on Vietnamese history and culture, and that they understood this country very well. Not at all. But they knew what they were up against. In his memoirs, Robert McNamara wanted to suggest to us, because it served, I think, his purposes. There may have been a genuine belief also, but it served his purposes to say the following: if only we had known, if only we had understood the Vietnamese, this would not have occurred. Well, he did know. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, one of the architects of the war, he did know. He and Lyndon Johnson, when they took the nation into war in 1965, were gloomy realists, privately. When the doors were closed, they said, we're not sure that we can win this war, even with major US fighting forces. So did many others in the administration. They were far from alone in believing this. They also wondered, and this is the more sobering truth as far as I'm concerned, whether it was even necessary to try to win it. Was Vietnam, in fact, of critical national security importance to the United States? They were not sure. Again, only when the doors were closed. Lyndon Johnson, in a quote that perhaps you've heard, I think captured something of this when he said, I don't believe it's worth fighting for, and I don't believe we can get out. The second part of that quote, though, leads me to the next point. Why then did they do this? if they weren't sure that they could win, and more importantly, they weren't sure it was necessary to try to win, to wage a war 7,000 miles from the coast of California, that was not, in other words, close to the physical boundaries of the United States, why did they do it? In a word, credibility. And I mean credibility here both in the sense of national credibility, but also partisan and personal credibility. Often we think of this term in exclusively national terms. It is US credibility that is at stake. Our allies will no longer be able to depend on us if we don't persevere. Our adversaries will no longer fear us. But it was partisan credibility and personal credibility that mattered at least as much. For 10 years, the United States had committed itself publicly to preserving a non-communist South Vietnam. To go against that vow was to potentially threaten the reputations of the United States, of course, but I think even more so the Democratic Party, and even more so the personal reputations of these policymakers. To threaten their careers. That is what I think was at stake, and that is what was of principal importance in driving the nation to war in 1965. I'm not suggesting here that idealism had nothing to do with it. This idea that we're ultimately doing what's best for the Vietnamese. I'm not suggesting that geopolitical concerns, and that's of course bound up with the national credibility. I'm not suggesting that didn't matter, but I would say that they ranked lower in the causal hierarchy than the concerns in particular about the domestic political ramifications of something other than standing firm in Vietnam, and the impact, the potential influence on reputation in more personal terms. But here's the thing. It's not enough. It's not enough for us in this room or anywhere else to say that therefore it's just about the presidents and their advisors. This war would not have happened absent something that I think is of critical importance, and that also, by the way, connects Vietnam to our present day. And it is what I like to call a permissive context. Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, and the others, and later Richard Nixon, operated in a permissive context. I'm referring here to Congress, I'm referring to the media, and I'm referring to public opinion, to ordinary Americans. We know, the evidence is now, I think, very powerful, that even as lawmakers voted almost unanimously in favor of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, which gave Lyndon Johnson a kind of blank check to wage war as he saw fit, privately, those lawmakers, many of them, including the Senate leadership in foreign policy, Senate Democratic leadership in foreign policy, said, is this really something we should be doing? Can we win? Again, is it necessary even to try to win? Have we convinced ourselves that it's actually in the national security interest of the United States to do this and to cause probably a lot of blood to be shed in the process? But did these lawmakers then act on that skepticism? No. They were not willing to challenge the administration in those critical months in 64 and 65, or for a long time thereafter. That's part of this permissive environment that allowed the escalation to occur. In the press, same thing happened. Important questions were asked in the press, but not enough. And especially after you see the first ground troops committed to the war, what happened? The famous rally around the flag effect, rally around the president effect. And so you see both lawmakers and journalists fallen behind Lyndon Johnson in the spring, those vital months in the winter and spring of 1965. As for the American public, it was largely apathetic in these months. To be sure, there were people in 64 and 65 all across this country who were against what was going on. The first teach-in happened at the University of Michigan already in March of 1965. So I don't mean to paint with too broad a brush, But broadly speaking, apathy was the order of the day. Most Americans were too busy with their daily lives to concern themselves with a war that was that far away. And to the extent that they did concern themselves, they were inclined to trust their leaders, which is a noble sentiment in many ways. They believed Lyndon Johnson and his aides when they said, this is a vital security interest and we are going to prevail. That permissive context is important, and it's here that I draw a connection to the present day. Because I would submit to you that there have been other American interventions since Vietnam in which a similar permissive environment was in operation, in play. Iraq 2003. I think you see something very similar with respect to Congress, the press, the media, and public opinion. So that's my takeaway. This is the lesson that I want to leave you with. The lesson is this. Something like Vietnam, something like this war could happen again. Not in the same way, not in the same place, but with equally destructive results. Because the eternal temptation of policymakers and presidents to seek short-term political advantage, to take the path of least immediate resistance, is there. And then to hope, as was certainly the case in the case with Vietnam, to hope that these new military measures will be successful. And in the Vietnam case, hope is all it was. Not confidence, not expectation, it was hope. But that temptation is always there, and it's there with us today, and it'll be there with us tomorrow. Combine that with the primacy of the executive branch in foreign policy, and you have the potential for this to happen. How do we keep it from not happening? We keep it from not happening, I think, fundamentally by educating ourselves, all of us. Doesn't mean we have to be experts. After all, we have elected representatives who are supposed to know these things better than we do, who have experts themselves who advise them. So I'm not calling for that. But there is a fundamental knowledge and interest that we have to have, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's domestic policy, state politics, local politics. It's up to us to be educated, to take an interest, and to be skeptical, not cynical. Very important distinction. But to ask searching questions, to demand of our leaders, to demand that they show accountability, that they demonstrate to us, especially on matters of war and peace, that this is, in fact, what we need to do, that the military option is truly the weapon of last resort, and not the first or second or third. If we do that, and if necessary, we then protest, if necessary, we then vote them out of office, then I think we drastically increase our chances to not have a repeat of this experience. This war was not just Lyndon Johnson's war. It was not just Robert McNamara's war. It was not just Richard Nixon's war. It was our war. Vietnam, in the end, was our war. Thank you.